What are you drinking?
Sounds good. It's a tea. It's a chai something tea.
An iced
Not entirely
chai?
sure. Yeah. So my name is Karla Boza. I am a coffee producer from El Salvador. Right now, I'm currently located in San Salvador, and our farm is called San Antonio Matepec, and it is located in the hills of San Jacinto, which is really close to the city. So it's a very unique farm in that it's very urban already. It's in a very urban area. So,
As you know, a few months ago, I released a video. This is one of the comments that was said. The comment was, to be honest, coffee farmers are low IQ human beings, and their well-being is the least of my concerns. If the farmers are not happy about the coffee price, then they can plant different plants. Nobody is forcing them to work in that industry. I just wanted to see if you had anything to share from your perspective on growing up in the coffee farming community and being in a producing country.
Yeah, so, I think that when I hear comments like this, I think that people oftentimes forget what the average and traditional coffee farmer looks like right now. It's usually a 70-year-old man. That's like the standard coffee producer, which is also very representative of who my dad is. So when I hear things like this, I'm like, okay, I get it that maybe there are some misconceptions of where these comments are coming from, but at the same time, knowing what coffee farmers look like and everything that they have to do throughout the year, and how is it possible that someone who has to run this entire business year round has a low IQ and things like that, it doesn't make sense. And also when I hear things like, okay, why don't they just plant something else? Well, you can't. Coffee takes a really long time to grow, so you can't just uproot, your coffee plants and turn it into something else. Unfortunately, that is what a lot of people have been doing with the current sea market crisis. But that's very unfortunate, when I hear things like that, it doesn't make sense, because a coffee producer isn't just a coffee producer. You have to think of all of these older men who already have the right to retire, who are still working at the farm, who are also having to deal and be like export experts. They also need to know and be up to date with weather patterns. They also have to be up to date with current technologies and ways of cultivating coffee and things like that. I don't think that someone with necessarily a low IQ is capable of specializing in all of these different things, because when you're a coffee farmer, you don't just grow coffee. You have to be up to date with all of these other things. Which is why, as a coffee farmer, you come to realize that you can't just grow something else from one day to the next. It doesn't work like that. A coffee plant, for it to be productive, it takes a lot of years and a lot of work and a lot of money also. So it's not that simple.
Yeah, I think that concept also translates to a lot of industries and a lot of people who are passionate about their craft. It's like one of those infinite games, if you're just playing just to win one year to the next, then you're not necessarily going to see the fruits, the literal fruits and the conceptual fruits. But I'm curious, on that note, just even play the devil's advocate. Do you think that maybe there's a little bit of oversaturation in coffee production, or do you think that it's more just about the logistics and the perceptions, and there is something that we can do to actually make it more viable?
The thing is, speaking from what I know, which is mostly coffee culture within El Salvador, growing coffee, it's really hard. We don't have access or even the possibility to use a lot of the equipment and technology that would maybe facilitate growing coffee for us. Like, El Salvador is literally a chain of volcanoes that go into the ocean. Like, that's what our landscape is. It's very, very hard for us to find flat surfaces. Our mountains are very steep, and that is why we can't necessarily mechanize like they do in a lot of other countries, such as Brazil, where they can like mechanically harvest coffee and their costs go down, and it's more like cost beneficial for them to be able to use all of these things. Like, for us, it becomes a lot harder, where we actually need to depend on people to hand pick the coffee. So it's little things like that where we're sort of at a disadvantage, but at the same time, they can also translate into, like better quality, more attention to detail, better selection process, things like that. So it's sort of a give and take in a way.
So you have faith for the coffee production side to really be able to shine through in the coming years, even through this pandemic, given the fact that there's still a growing demand for a more specialized product that maybe hasn't been saturated yet. Is that more or less?
I would like to think so. The thing is, I think that unfortunately, due to the current coffee crisis and everything that's going on, a lot of farmers, they have abandoned their farms. It's not viable for you to be implementing all of these strategies that at the end they are money, like paying people to do all of these things by hand. Like it's very demanding for you. We're also in a crisis where banks locally, they don't want to finance coffee anymore because it doesn't make sense. So when you don't have access to credits and when you don't have enough money to necessarily like pay everyone, when you have to pay them, the easiest thing for you to do is just to abandon your farm. And that is what has been happening a lot in El Salvador. You see how a lot of farms from one day to the next, the people go in, they take out all of the wood, and then they get turned into strip malls and things like that. And it's very sad. So I think that right now with this crisis, the few producers that are left, I think that we've come to the realization that we can't compete necessarily in quantity with countries like Brazil or even Honduras, which is next door. Like we have fallen behind in that sense because our coffee forests, they're very old and they're not necessarily as productive as they used to be. But on the other hand, we do know, and I have noticed that a lot more people are trying to specialize in quality instead of quantity. So I think that is maybe like one way to sort of survive as a coffee farmer in El Salvador. But at the same time, realistically speaking, that's really hard because you sell maybe a little bit of your crop as specialty, and then most of it gets sold as commodity. So it's a really hard balance also that you need to play. And this also ties back into, like the initial comment of the low IQ. It's like, okay, like as a coffee producer, you're constantly playing this fine line of how much coffee you can sell at a certain price point in order to be able to survive for a whole year because you only get paid once a year. So it's very hard. And I think that a lot of people necessarily don't understand like all of these little components of how coffee producers literally live a very different way, even financially, than most people do, or even other agriculture markets do.
So what would you say is like maybe a bit of the tipping point where that balance just tells the farmer, hey, look, this is not working out. Maybe you should find something else to do? Or, what do you think is maybe the hope for these farmers who have put in all the years and all their expertise? You mentioned, diving a little bit more into quality over quantity. What do you think are some of the right answers there?
The thing is, I don't think that there is necessarily a right answer. It's very complicated and it depends a lot on how big your farm is, how much access to credits you have, if you even have access to these things, if you have access to specialized markets, because it doesn't matter if you're growing fantastic specialty quality coffee if you can't allocate it into a market, if you can't find a buyer. And that is unfortunately what happens a lot of the times. Like I've tasted one of the most memorable coffees that I can think of has been this pacamara, and it was this variant that tastes a little bit like onion, which sounds super weird, but it's fantastic and it's mind blowing. But this older person that was selling it, he doesn't have an access to any specialized market, so he sells it with everything else, and it goes into a big pile with all of these other coffees, and that's the fate of that one fantastic coffee, which I'm pretty sure would be paid incredibly well if he simply knew how to approach all of these other situations, and that's what happens to maybe, and the person that I'm talking about, he's an older man who is college educated. He has a great network. He has access to a lot of things. He has a higher level of privilege in a way, yet still he can't access all of these other little markets that are willing to pay for that. So then when you translate that into maybe a smaller farmer that maybe doesn't have the same education level, doesn't have the same social networks that he can tap into to sell their coffee, what has been happening until recently is that a lot of these people, they abandon their farms and they migrate. They go to the United States usually, and that's, like they leave the country because it's just not financially viable for them to be able to continue in coffee farming, because coffee farming is very expensive. It's not as cheap as a lot of people usually assume.
And that's the dilemma, right? So we're trying to figure out, okay, what can we do? What's the silver lining, or potentially, if the coffee producers are struggling, what can we do maybe on more of the consuming level, or even importing, roasting level, to hold on to that which can thrive and can exist?
I think that's something that people can start to do. And this is something that I have been trying to advocate for a while now. It's just like request transparency, like ask people, how much are you paying? How much are you paying? If it's in a cafe, how much are you paying your roaster? How much is your roaster paying for coffee through your importer? How much is your importer paying the producer? Like trying to get down to these little things. I think that makes a difference. Maybe not necessarily because, like things are going to change like that, but because you are going through all of these little bridges that normally people don't have access to. Like it's still very unbelievable to me that a lot of farmers, not once have they seen a coffee bag with their name on it. They don't know where their coffee ends. Like that is the traditional story of how things happen for coffee farmers. Fortunately, now we have access to the internet. There's social media, and a lot of, I guess, like millennial coffee farmers, like we've been able to bridge these gaps, But when it comes to the majority of coffee farmers, who are usually 70-year-old men, they're not on Instagram, they're barely on Facebook, So it's like little things like that. So I think that by demanding this information, I think that you can sort of, in a way, approach the end of the coffee chain from both ends. I think that farmers can have more access to consumers, and I think the consumers can also have more access to producers. And I think that just starts to humanize coffee production a lot more, because like most of these countries where coffee is being consumed, you don't have coffee trees right there. You don't know how coffee is grown. You don't know how labor intensive it is. You don't know what it entails to be, like guarding this piece of land that is socially and also environmentally responsible. Like all of these little things, they don't come into your head simply because you're not exposed to it. But I do think that social media is a great way to bridge these gaps and sort of humanize coffee farming, and for people to be able to click, like, oh, coffee is a fruit. Like that is one of the most mind-blowing things for the average consumer. That I don't know why people think, like that it's a bean, because we call it a bean, but the fact that it's a fruit, like little things like that, like they make a difference. And I think that they start to capture people into wanting to know more and wanting to bridge these gaps. And I think that is like the glimpse of hope that I have seen. And it has also been the glimpse of hope for our farm. Like personally, if it weren't for social media, I don't know if it would still be running, to be honest.
Wow, that's a huge testimony, and thank you for sharing that, and like being vulnerable to that, because what I hear you saying here is, there, one of the big solutions is really focusing on the communication aspect. How can we, like you said, humanize it, create those relationships between the people on the one side, the consuming, who really are passionate about serving a higher quality product and having that transparency, and then the producers who have been passionate about increasing their quality, taking care of the earth that they're planting on, that they're living on, and then getting those into the right hands, like the right people who really want to appreciate that, right? But especially in this day and age with technology, it's like it's 2 clicks away from contacting people in producing countries for the majority of time. But as you said, there's a bit of technological barrier sometimes if people are not they don't understand it, right?
Absolutely, you have that, and then you also have language barriers, and then you also have accessibility barriers. Like it would be very hard for me to be able to get my dad on a Zoom call with you, not only because there is like no phone reception at the farm, but also because he's a 70-year-old man, and for him it's really hard to get on Zoom. You know, like he's mastered Facebook, but and email, but that's about it. So it's little things like that where people, I think, sometimes forget what a privilege it is to be able to enjoy really good coffee. Like it's really hard to produce. It's really hard for it to get to the end consumer. So I think that yes, it's something that is available to us every day, but at the same time, like it's almost a miracle that it ended on the other side of the world and that you're able to drink it.
It is a miracle. coffee
Yeah,
coffee can be a miracle for a lot of people. So
yeah,
I think that's why both of us are so passionate about it. That's why we're doing the work that we
yeah,
do. And
exactly.
yeah, so I'm excited. I'm excited for some of those solutions being able to be more accessible and come into play a little bit more. Like you said, there's no right answer, but
Mhm.
we have to do a bit of the work to kind of find a lot of the work to find
Absolutely.
out what that is. So
And I think that it has to be mutually beneficial. Like I have noticed recently how there's a lot of interest from roasters to sort of like protect farmers and to sort of like guard their livelihood in a way, which I think is fantastic. But at the same time, like to me, it's incredibly important also that our roasters are doing super well and that their families are well and that they're also like doing well during a pandemic. Like this has affected everyone, and just like it has affected farmers, there's a lot of roasters who shut down, there's a lot of cafes who shut down, and sort of just like bridging this community like barriers and just like making it a little bit cozier for everyone and just like checking in with everyone, like what are you doing, like I love to send pictures of the farm, even though if it's like good things or bad things to our roasters. And I'm like, we just had a little landslide because it won't stop raining, but at the same time, look, the coffee is ripening and it's like it's looking great, and we'll have like a great crop this year. So it's like humanizing both ends, because I also have absolutely no idea, no concept, no understanding of what it's like to be a roaster or what it's like to have a coffee shop. So it's like making it a little bit more human, and mystifying this whole like coffee scene from both ends, and just I think it's just being more in touch with each other basically. And I think that that's also like another glimpse of hope, that I see in the industry at least.